Hello and welcome to the tutorial for the 4-ply knitted version of Arria. My name is Faye from Faye-Hughes Designs, and I'm going to take you through all of the essential elements that you need to be able to create this pattern. So let's start off with the materials that you're going to need. I used a River Knits yarn for this. Yarn A is a mini skein, it's a 20-gram mini skein in a 4-ply, which is a fingering weight version. You only need 20 grams of that, which is 80 meters, but 87 yards. And then the other one that I used, which is the dominant colour but is yarn B, is another River Knits yarn, and it's in the colourway called Shroom. And again, that's the 4-ply fingering weight yarn, and you'll need two 100-gram skeins of that. Each skein comes in at about 400 meters, 437 yards. And both of those yarns are actually British Blueface Leicester, and they've got quite a nice high twist on them. They are also superwashed. You will also need a set of 3.5mm interchangeable needles, and I used an 80cm cable. You can go larger than that depending on what you prefer, but I find it's a little bit footery when you're beginning off the shawl and you've got a much longer cable, so I tend to keep it shorter and then have a more bunched up project further on, rather than having lots of cable length available to me getting in the way at the beginning of my project. You'll also need 2 place markers and a tapestry needle, a pair of sharp scissors and blocking boards and pins. This is definitely a project that benefits from blocking, but I say that with every single design because I love wet blocking my finished objects and getting the most out of them and making sure that they're nice and clean. So let's move on to the construction of Arria. It is a bottom-up shawl. It uses garter stitch throughout, and it also increases on the sides in every single row. So you're doing an increase with every row. It has a slip stitch border edge, which gives it a lovely little twist. But one of the details I'll talk about is trying to make sure you're loose on your tension at that point, so that you don't have a really tight edge to your shawl. It uses Intarsia as a technique, and because you're only using 3 balls at any one time, it's quite a nice easy project if you've never done Intarsia before, and I'll take you through the basics of being able to do that. That's all you need to know in construction. This is actually a really simple shawl, and like I say, if you're new to Intarsia, it's a great one to start out with. It's nothing too difficult. It's actually a really lovely mindless project that once you've got the first couple of sections under your belt, you'll have the rhythm of it and you won't need to keep on going back and referring to your pattern. That's really what I specialise in. I like stuff that's nice and easy, repeatable, and that you don't have to carry a pattern around with you. That's my ideal kind of a project. So if you wanted to do a yarn substitute on this, then I would definitely recommend you try and get something with the same meterage, so 400 meters, 437 yards per 100 grams. I can see it working well with something like a skinny single yarn as well. You could try and go down to a sport weight, but I think you'll be pushing it on the amount that you need if you want this shawl to be as large as the one stated within this pattern. If you're going to use a variegated yarn and you don't want colour pooling, one of the reasons I really love what Becky and Marcus do at River Knits is that they do really short colour changes, so you don't get colour pooling and you get a beautiful blend of colours throughout your project. So if you're trying to mimic what it is that I have done but you can't get hold of River Knits yarn, maybe you're abroad from the UK, then what I would suggest is you make sure you use something with a really short colour change. If you go to something that's going to pull, I feel like that's going to probably detract from the Intarsia triangles that you've got of the little mermaid swish tails. Obviously completely up to you, but if you're trying to mimic what it is that I've done, then you need those short colour changes to make that work. The beauty also of the 20 gram mini skein, I used 15 grams within this project, is you can use up any little bit that you've got left in your stash. If you wanted to, you could change the colours. I know somebody that is making this and they're going to go through an ombre right the way up through the tails, so each triangle will be a slightly different shade. So it's really up to you. It's a great way of using up little bits and pieces within your stash. It might be that you want to use a semi-tonal or a solid for the main bulk of the colour, and then use something with the colour variegated or the ombre for the triangles. It's one of these patterns that's really open to your own interpretation. So just a quick note before you start on getting your gauge and tension swatch. Rather than doing a completely different swatch, what I would suggest you do is you start the pattern off and you check your dimensions against the first triangle in yarn A. The unblocked tension is given to you on page 2 in the pattern, but essentially if you can get to this point where you've got the correct number of stitches, my initial triangle when it was measured unblocked was 16 centimetres in width with a depth of 3.5 centimetres. So if you're getting to the tension that I've stated in the pattern and that's the size of your first triangle, then you're good to go. Equally, you might want a looser garter stitch, in which case go for it. This is quite a forgiving pattern, so it just means that if you go looser you will have fewer triangles to deal with, and if you want to go tighter then you will have more triangles that you can make into your shawl. One of the things that you might find easier with yarn management is if you cake up all of your yarn, and if you do a centre pull rather than taking from round the side of your yarn. I find that what that means is that my yarn stays still, it doesn't want to move about, and therefore when you're doing the Intarsia you'll find that you're taking your yarn through your needles from the back to the front, up and over, and it's quite easy to get it in a tangle. So you can help to minimise that by having yarn that doesn't move anywhere, and that's achieved through a centre pull ball. And I would do that for all of them. If you really want to, you could take one end from the side and one end from the middle and just work from one cake when you're using your yarn B, but again that has the potential to get really quite messy. So I would actually go down to 2 separate cakes of yarn for the 2 sides of your Intarsia and the triangles. So you will end up with 3 loads of yarn at any one time. One which will be used on the right hand side of the triangle itself, and then one that you use on the left hand side. And your yarn A ball will also be the dominant one, so when you have just rows of yarn B, it will be your yarn B cake 1 that gets used for that, but all of the instructions for that are given within the pattern. So we're going to start, and I have already cast on 3 stitches on my needle, and with row 1, which is your wrong side row, you are going to, with yarn at the front, so there's my working yarn, so that needs to come to the front of my work. I'm going to slip that stitch purlwise, which means it's not having any twist in it. Then the next step is to pop your yarn to the back, and I'm going to knit front, knit back. So there's me knitting to the front, and I need to get my needle and pop it through the back and knit a second stitch off that initial 1 stitch and pop that off. So that's my increase, and then I need to knit 1. And one of the things that you need to be aware of, because the side stitches are always slipped, is when you knit this final one, try and keep your tension a little bit loose. So that was row 1, moving on to row 2, and what I'm doing here is exactly the same. So with yarn at front, I am slipping that off purlwise, and again I'm trying to keep the tension quite loose, and I'll show you why in a moment. And then my yarn goes to the back, and I'm doing a knit front and a knit back on that same 1 stitch, so there's another increase, and knit 2, so knit 1, and again I'm trying to keep my tension on that final knit quite loose. And turn my work, and we'll move on to row 3. So with my yarn at the front, slip it purlwise, yarn to the back, and I'm going to do a knit to the front, knit to the back, and then what I need to do is pop a place marker in there, because this is going to show what the centre stitch is. Knit 1, pop a second place marker in, and then this is another knit front back. So my needle's going as if to knit through the front, pop it through, but I don't take that stitch off. Take my needle and pop it through to the back of my work and knit a second off that initial stitch, and then knit the final stitch there, and again keeping it quite nice and loose. That's row 3 done. So I've increased already, I'm up to 7 stitches, and I have place marked where the centre stitch is. So let me show you once more, because now you're into the standard. This is your row repeat from now until the end of the shawl. So you're basically on yarn at front, slip purlwise, yarn to the back, knit front, knit back, knit all the way along until 2 stitches from the end. Always slip your markers and move them up, so you're always showing where your centre stitch is. Here I am, 2 stitches from the end. That's a knit front, knit back, knit 1 at the side, keeping your tension loose. And you can see that that triangular shape has already started, and that triangular shape will move on. And this is the initial set of rows before you move into the Intarsia. So because you're increasing on every second stitch in and second from the end stitch, you get this lovely triangular increase to your shawl, and when you finish and you block it, it's going to come out and be a gorgeous triangular shape. Now let me show you why it is that it's so important to keep it loose at the ends. This has just finished wet blocking. This is my finished object for this shawl, and because you're slipping the first stitch of every row, that can lead your work to be a little bit tight on the end. It's not very forgiving. So by keeping it ever so slightly looser, you get a bit more stretch into that end. If you don't, then the chances are that you're going to create a tightness on the 2 even edges that doesn't match in with the bulk of stitches that you've got in between them, so you've got more chance of that buckling. So just keep an eye on that, keep it ever so slightly looser, not really loose because you don't want to see big loops coming out at the side of your shawl, but don't be really tight with it. You want it to have some level of give, like I have here. So that's how you start off the shawl, and that shows your basic row repeats for the side of your Arria knitted 4-ply shawl, and you, like I say, you continue that all the way up. It couldn't be easier. So just a quick note on your stitch counts. You'll see that throughout the pattern I have given you the stitch count for every single row, and you'll see a circle beside it. That's so that as you work through the pattern you can give that a tick and you know where you are within your pattern. It's fairly self-explanatory anyway, but you might be a little bit like me and you just love to be able to tick off something that's been completed, so that's why I provide that. Now your stitch markers are always going to be in the centre stitch, and either side of that centre stitch you should always have an even number of stitches. So I've come to the end of my first triangle in yarn A, and I know that I have got 19 stitches on this side, 1 in the middle, and 19 stitches on this side, so that's my 39 stitches. Now as I move into the Intarsia rows, what will happen is that your yarn A increases will happen here, and it's not that you're creating extra stitches at this point in the row, it's simply widening out and you're using more stitches as you go. So let me show you that in the shawl. So let me show you how that works within the actual Intarsia itself. When you're doing the Intarsia rows, what happens is you use more and more of your yarn B stitches to increase the size of your triangle. You're not actually increasing your stitch count here, it's only ever at the ends of the rows. And that's what gives you your Intarsia effect. So I want to show you how I trap down yarn A as I work through the project. I'm moving on to row 20, which is a right side row, and it starts off in exactly the same way. So my yarn is at the front and I'm slipping that first stitch purlwise. My yarn is going to the back, but then at the same time I'm also joining in yarn B first cake. And basically, so the pattern continues where it's a yarn front, where it's a knit front, get that out of the way, and a knit back. And then what I want to do is start trapping down yarn A, because I want to carry that all the way back to this center stitch here. Now you don't have to do this. If you prefer, you can cut your yarn, you can rejoin it here when you come onto the Intarsia, and then you've got a lot more ends to weave in. I'm just not a massive fan of weaving in ends, so this is a neat way of dealing with that and not having to. So I've got my needle through my stitch ready to go, and I simply move yarn A up, and I'm holding it down with my finger. I make sure I've got my working yarn, and I'm just knitting. And I move on to the next stitch and I move yarn A down. I'm trapping it down and I knit. Next stitch, I'm trapping it up. Next stitch, trapping it down and up and down, and I'll show you when I get to the end how this actually looks. So I'm just coming to the end. I'm going to slip that stitch there, and by the end I don't mean the end of the row, I mean the end of the time that I'm going to be carrying along yarn A. So let me just do a couple more stitches and then I will turn. You'll see I'm no longer carrying that yarn along because I have left it at the centre. It's now exactly where I need it to be for the next sets of Intarsia rows. It's right in the middle. I haven't had to cut it. There are two ends that I don't have to weave in, and it's there just ready to be used. And it's made no detrimental effect to my knitting whatsoever, and it's just sat there ready to go. And I get to just continue to the end of the row. So knit front, knit back, knit with looser tension. Look at that pop of mustard that's coming through. I just love this yarn colour. So there's the front. You can see we've got the beginnings of the standard rows which have just got yarn B in them. And here is the back. Let me just unravel this for you. And you can see yarn A is there ready when I need it next. I've minimised the number of ends and I'm ready to continue, and this will just sit here waiting until I need it again. That's the beauty of Intarsia. This is the only bit of trapping down and carrying back that you need to do. And you can see here you've also got two choices. You can trap it down as you're going through these plain rows, you can trap it down a couple more times, or you can just leave it and then just pick it up and use it again when you're ready to for the next set of Intarsia rows. Completely up to you. I prefer having it trapped down, but I thought I would do one of each to show you what the difference is. I'm just not a fan of having stuff like that loose on my shawl. It's a bit precarious for me. So the reality is though, when I weave in this end, I'm probably going to trap that down further and weave in the end coming down here. So if you want to do it that way, then go ahead, that's an option for you. So I have got 5 more rows that I need to do just in yarn B, cake 1, and I will go and do them, and then when I come back we will look at how we do the Intarsia rows and the setup for that, and introducing yarn B cake 2 and going through a couple of rows of that. But then that's really it done. We're kind of there. When I say that this is a really lovely basic Intarsia shawl, I meant it. I don't do difficult. So I'll see you at the end of row 25. So I've just finished row 25, which gives me 6 rows plain just in yarn A, and that uses the first cake, cake 1. And now we're going on to the Intarsia rows. So it's exactly the same set of instructions for the beginnings and ends. So with the yarn at front, slip 1 purlwise, yarn to the back, knit front back. And then you're knitting to 1 stitch before the place marker. So there we go, 1 stitch, knit that, slip your place marker, and then we're changing to yarn A. So the first stitch, which is in between the 2 place markers, is going to be in yarn A. Now, and then you're joining in with yarn B, cake 2. Leave enough of a tail that you can weave it in, and simply knit your next Intarsia block with your new yarn that you've just brought in. And then you're working to the same pattern sequence. You knit 2 stitches before the end, knit front back, knit 1 but keep your tension loose. Okay, so knit front, knit back, knit 1. Okay, I'm about to move on to row 27. So what I want to do is bring all my yarns to the front, try and keep them untangled if I can. And this is one of the factors of Intarsia, you're on a constant mission to try and untangle your yarns. It's just one of those things. So, continuing in yarn B, cake 2, yarn at front, slip, knit front back, and then what you're doing is knitting to 1 stitch before the yarn A stitch. So let's do that. Slip with yarn at front, move my yarn back, knit to the front, knit to the back to create that increase, and then I'm knitting to 1 stitch before the yarn A. One more. There we go, so there's my yarn A stitch and I'm on 1 before. Now because this is an Intarsia row on the wrong side of the row, and ignore that this is quite a loose stitch, you're going to tighten that up. We're about to change back over to yarn B, but to do that we need to make sure that the yarns are on the right side. So what was yarn B cake 1, which is now my old working yarn, comes to the front of my work, and I move that over. And what I need to do is move back my yarn A. But so that I don't get holes in my work, what I actually want to do is move my yarn A back but pop it under the old working yarn. So the new working yarn goes under, then I pop it to the back of my work and I knit that stitch. And let me just show you, and let's knit that one too, and the third stitch. And then all I'm going to do is just tighten that up, and that will get tighter as you go up through the rows and as you weave in that end. So now I've increased from 1 stitch in the row below in yarn A up to 3 stitches in yarn A. And again, because I'm doing Intarsia and I'm on the wrong side, I've just finished with yarn A, so I need to bring that forward, move my yarn over, and do exactly the same thing. So I've got my next yarn, which is my yarn B first cake. I've passed it underneath the outgoing yarn so that I'm not creating a hole, and I'm popping that to the front of my work. And all of these are going to be tightened up. And then I'm knitting to 2 stitches before the end. Two stitches from the end. So that's a knit front, knit back for the increase 1, and 1 knit on the end. And let me just turn that over and show you. It won't look very obvious to begin with, but as your triangle grows you'll start to see more and more detail as it widens out. And like I say, when you start to weave in those ends, just give that little tug and this will tighten off a little bit. So now that all of the yarns are attached for the Intarsia row, I'm going to show you a right side and a wrong side again, and I'll just knit right the way through it and show you what happens and talk you through what I do with my yarn at the same time. So I'm on a right side row, which means that the right hand of my work to the right of the yarn B triangle is all in yarn. So I'm on a right side row, which means that all of the stitches to the right of my yarn A triangle are in yarn B cake 1, and all of the stitches to the left of my yarn A triangle are all in yarn B cake 2. And these are the only 3 loads of yarn that I'm going to be dealing with throughout this project. So continue with the pattern. With yarn up front, slip 1 purlwise, put my yarn to the back, knit front, knit back to increase, and then I knit all the way along to 1 stitch before the yarn A stitch. So we're coming up to that now. 3 stitches until I hit yarn A, so I need to knit 2 of those in yarn B, so that's 1 stitch before the yarn A stitch. Now because we're working on the right side, all of my yarns are on the right side of my work, so I don't need to do any forward and back. But what I do need to do is take my yarn A underneath my outgoing yarn B so that I'm trapping it down, and then I'm going to be knitting 1, 2, slip my marker, 3, slip my marker, 4, and extending the yarn A stitches by 1 more so that I'm increasing that triangle. Then I'm moving over to yarn B cake 2, and I need to do the same, bring it over the outgoing yarn, which was the yarn A, and start knitting with that instead. And what that means is that yarn B cake 1 is left at the back of my work until I need it again. Yarn A is left at the back of my work in the space where I need it again, and I continue on with yarn B cake 2. I'm coming up to 2 stitches from the end, so that is a knit front, knit back for the increase, knit 1 with a loose tension. So that is another right side Intarsia row done. I've gone from 1 yarn A stitch to 3 to 5 in that latest row, and on the row that I'm about to do it will be 7 yarn A stitches. So let's move my yarns around again and get ready to start another wrong side Intarsia row, which means that I will be starting with yarn B cake 1. Slip that stitch purlwise with the yarn at front, put my yarn to the back, knit to the front, knit to the back, and knit to 1 stitch before the yarn A stitch. Okay, so that's 1 stitch before the yarn A stitch. So again, I need to pull my outgoing yarn to the front. I need to get my yarn A and try and untangle it. And that needs to go to the back of my work, but before I put it to the back I have to take it underneath my yarn A outgoing yarn and then put it to the back. And again that just traps it down and it means that I don't get holes in my work. And then I'm knitting all the way through, moving the place markers. I've knitted all my yarn A ones and I need to knit 1 more and then I'm changing my yarn, so that will give me 7. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So I've extended the number of yarn A stitches by 1 at each end. And then again I'm moving back to yarn B ball 1. So yarn A comes to the front, yarn B comes up and through and comes underneath yarn A, and then I put it to the back. And you see I've moved that over because that's easier to work from. And then I'm knitting to 2 stitches from the end. Knit from back and knit 1. And let's show you how that's looking. You can see that that triangle is starting to build up, and again just tighten up those stitches there. So the triangle's extending. We've got an even number of stitches either side of the triangle here. We also have this lovely little definition coming on the side. It's got a lovely little twist and a slight lacy hole to it where you've done the knit front back. I really like how the edges worked up on this shawl. And that's kind of it for what you need to know. So on the right side, your yarns will always be at the back of your work ready to work, and when you're working on wrong side you have to move your old working yarn to the front and your new working yarn goes underneath the old working yarn, which is your outgoing yarn, and then you put it to the back ready to start working with it. That always means that your yarns should be on the right side of your work, whether you're working with them or leaving them until you need them for the next row. And that's everything kind of that you need to know for doing the knitting part of it. So I want to take you through the cast off, bind off that I used for the Arria shawl. I used something that's got a bit of stretch to it because I didn't, given that this is the part that's going to be up at your neck, it can be quite uncomfortable if your bind off is too tight, and this one offers just enough stretch that it's not wavy, it doesn't create your work to pucker, but it's going to be comfortable around your neck as well. So it's a really simple bind off, and I'm just going to show you on this little mini one that I've been doing. You basically start by knitting 2, and then all you do is place your left hand needle through both of your stitches that you've just knit at the front, which means that your right hand needle will be placed at the back, and you can simply yarn round and knit them together. And then you knit one and you repeat that action. So you pop your left hand needle through the front, your right hand needle will be at the back, and you just knit them together. It's quite a quick cast off, bind off to do, and like I say, it leaves a nice amount of stretch. And one of the things that I find easiest to do when you're doing this, I'll show you, is once you've knitted one, I kind of almost tug down on my work a little, because I find that that makes the loops more obvious where to go in to put my left needle up through the front. Yarn round and knit the two together, and that gives you that really nice stretchy bind off. And the way to deal with your final stitch is as you would when you're fastening off any. Let's pretend that is my final stitch. So yarn round, knit two together, and all I would do is cut that yarn and pull it through. And that is what has given such a lovely finish on the shawl, which means that when you come to block it, you can pull this out a bit more if that's what you need to do, depending on how your tension has been on the side panels of your shawl. But you can see there's quite a difference. That's how much give I've got with the slip stitch at the edge, and that's how much give I've got with the stretchy bind off. So a quick note on how to wet block your Arria shawl. I tend to wet block almost all of my projects. Yarn has been through an industrial process, my cat chews the end of it, it gets rolling about on the floor. There are all sorts of reasons why I would want to clean my finished objects before I actually wear them. A really good reason though is that wet blocking will set the stitches in your finished object. So for something like a shawl, it will pull out the peaks that you need to pull out. It will make everything seem more regular. It can soften it up considerably when you've actually washed it with a wool wash. It does your final piece justice, and I always think it's a shame when somebody tells me that they don't wet block stuff, because they've put so many hours into creating a piece and then not given it that final flourish, and that's what wet blocking does. So wet blocking this shawl is exceptionally easy. The blocking mats that I use have got detachable sidebars which give me a nice straight edge to work to. I sell them in my shop, so I'll actually put a link to them in the down bar. Now what that means is step one is to start from the centre top of the shawl and pin out the way, so you've got an even length on either side of your shawl from that central point. Step two is to pull down to the bottom point of your shawl. Don't pull too much, just enough that you don't think that your yarn is going to pucker at all, that it's just, you're not stretching it too taut but you're not leaving it too loose either. And then step 3 and 4, if you want to, is to pin the two side edges of the shawl. Now I found that because this is garter stitch and it's quite squidgy, I actually didn't need to do that, so all I did was pin down the bottom triangle, a little bit of the point, 2 points up at the top, and that top edge, and that was all the pinning that I would do. And normally I would stick 200 to 300 pins into a shawl. This one only took about 50. Because it's garter stitch, it's just a very different type of a stitch to block out, so it's a really nice and easy one to wet block. But if you were thinking about getting away with not doing it, I would say definitely do it, because it will really give you such a beautiful point on the end of your shawl and just really let it come to life. So that's everything that you need to know for knitting your own Arria shawl. Thank you very much for buying my pattern, it's much appreciated, and I would love to see versions of it on Instagram and as a project in Ravelry if you're able to upload them. You can use hashtag Arria shawl as well, and I'll be able to see them that way and talk to you about your beautiful versions. So thank you very much. Bye bye.